So last week I talked about intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw's work, and interdependence, and weaving some about karma and causality in there. And I promised that this week we would talk about dependent arising, a central teaching from the Buddhist philosophy and psychology, really about causality and how we cause ourselves or get involved and get tangled up with suffering, and how we can free our hearts. And this teaching of causality is really very central in the mindfulness, in all of our mindfulness work, and really interesting because it's all pointing to how it unfolds on its own without our, we have a kind of automatic participation. But I promised Jack, I actually asked Jack if he would speak first this morning. So I realized that I've started to launch into it, but I want to make room for you as we agreed upon.
You can go first if you want.
No, that's fine.
As you wish, dear.
Well, no, it's the plan we made together.
I see. At your request, dear. Yes.
Oh, man. We could go all morning because I'll tell you, I like to have the last word, and so does he.
So, as we talked about, you asked if I could do some teaching that might lead into what you're going to do on dependent origination. And I want to talk about the relational aspects of mindfulness. The most important rule when you are a monastic, a monk or a nun, the one that really defines your life, is not celibacy, is not, eating one meal a day, or meditating and so forth. The most significant rule is that you are not allowed to eat food that was not put into your bowl or into your hands that morning after sunrise, within 1 arm's length of your body. So what that means is that our kind of notions, well, the monks may have a little hut way up in the mountains or go live in a cave, which sometimes they do. But every day they have to go down from the cave to Venice Beach with their bowl and have somebody put food in it, or they don't eat. And what this means is that the entire structure of the last 2,600 years of Buddhist training involves both a certain stepping back, in this case of the monks and nuns as renunciates, but also a profound relationship. And in fact, the monks and nuns have to in some way be inspiring enough in their presence that people want to feed them. So so they offer teachings or do blessings or all those kind of things. So built into the sense of mindfulness and community is the sense of relationship. And if you look at what we might talk about in another Sunday morning, the Eightfold Path of Practice, half of the Eightfold Path are relational practices: right speech or wise speech, wise livelihood, wise action to not cause harm to others and to act in a way with integrity and truthfulness and so forth, and wise intention to speak and act in ways that don't promote divisiveness or harm or undermine human beings, but that actually promote everyone's well-being. Normally, when people think of mindfulness who haven't practiced much, the image is of the solitary person sitting there navel-gazing basically and doing quiet meditation, which has a great benefit, especially in the kind of crazy culture in which we live. Just to begin to quiet the mind and tend the heart is a radical act. But it turns out that the word mindfulness in Sanskrit and Pali, sati, sampajanya, is a compound word, and one part means mindful presence, to actually be present for life. And the other part is mindful response. It's actually noticing and being aware of the context within which we're enveloped and engaged. In Zen, they put it another way. There are only two things. You sit and you sweep the garden. And it doesn't matter how big the garden is. That is the garden of the world. You quiet the mind, attend the heart, and then you get up and you tend the relationships you have with the world around you. So, at least as the story in the mythology is told, the Buddha, after his enlightenment, wandered the dusty roads of India for 45 years teaching, and all the texts and so forth are mostly records of his teachings and dialogues with people in those 45 years. And he did that while abiding in nirvana. So obviously nirvana doesn't mean your eyes are closed, or you removed yourself, because he wandered and he talked and he ate and he got sick like anybody else and got well and had all these relations. So what does it mean? He rested in an openness of liberation and mystery and vastness and compassion and love that are your true nature as well, that is your Buddha nature. And he would meet people with this great sense of freedom and openness and say, join me. Here's how you can practice. Here's how you too can live with a liberated heart and a quiet mind and a wise and liberated heart. It wasn't about turning you into something, not a Buddhist, spare your friends and family, but to turn you into a remember that you have the capacity to awaken your own Buddha nature. Now, what this does is it invites a profound shift of identity from the ways that we're caught in the world in our small sense of self, our separateness that's different than mystery and vastness. It's sometimes called the body of fear, this sense of separateness, that we're separate from it all, this fiction. And based on fear, which is the opposite of liberation, all kinds of suffering is created. We fear one another, we judge one another. All you have to do is look at the latest political tweeting that happened about Elijah Cummings in Baltimore, being a city of filth and infested and things like that, that foments in some way the hatred and racism that divides us. And yet, in the Eightfold Path, the step of wise intention is to have words and action that are free from hatred, free from judgment, free from racism and all the kinds of ways that we create divisiveness with one another. And what this means is that the invitation of mindfulness is to step out of the sense of separateness and realize our interdependence. So Trudy and I were in Europe a couple of summers ago, and one of the things we were able to do after teaching some at Oxford, we maybe have talked about this here when we came back a couple of years ago, was to teach in Parliament. And the British Parliament has a group called Mindful UK, published a great big plan for making UK mindful. We just hope it works with Brexit. But anyway, and at first there were 85 members. Now there's 100 more members of Parliament that belong to Mindful UK. And they're incorporating mindfulness in education, in the national healthcare system, in the corrective system, and so forth, led by some members of Parliament and some of the ministers or shadow ministers in the government. So we got a chance to sit and meet with some of these who sit together every week. And there were people from both sides of the aisle, and they did a meditation. In this case, I led it, and then we had this discussion, all of us together. And as part of the meditation, beside mindfulness practice and loving kindness, then there was also an envisioning of if you were to act from your Buddha nature, from the best of yourself, or if you were to envision who has walked through the walls of this parliament the last many centuries that you most admire, and take the spirit of their creativity and their, fostering of well-being for the whole populace, who would that be? After we sat, they talked, and they said it was the best thing they did all week. They were usually at odds with one another, but they could quiet themselves, they could listen to each other, and they were remarkably honest and vulnerable with one another. So this is the stepping out of the separate sense of self to realize that we're in it together as human beings, as creatures on this marvelous planet. And as we learn to become present and mindful, it becomes a kind of power, you could say, or a gift that begins to transform what we touch and what's around us. So one of the examples that I think of, and it's kind of a more grand example, is many years ago when I was living in the monasteries of Thailand and Burma and India and so forth. In Bangkok especially, there was a big student revolution against the military dictatorship of that time. This was in the early 1970s. And lots of heated battles on the street between the students and the military, and barricades, and the kind of thing that we know happens worldwide at different places when the young people, fortunately, are the ones to carry the torch and say, this is not right, what's happening in our country. Students were killed. There was a lot of fear in the country because it was escalating and getting worse, and nothing seemed to be able to tamp down the conflict. And then one morning, the abbot of a forest monastery not far outside of Bangkok brought a whole group of monastics, of monks and nuns, barefoot, to walk into Bangkok and to walk between the lines of the barricades of the students and the military and simply stand there for a few hours in silence. They didn't say anything, they didn't do anything, they just stood in the hot sun, absolutely still. And there was at that time especially still so much respect for the devotion and dedication of the monastics who dedicate their lives to awakening in that culture, that no one did anything. No one would dare fire a shot or get angry act it out in other ways. And after the monastics left and everybody chanted and bowed as they did, as they left, the whole conflict got tamped down a little bit. And that day they began to talk to one another, realizing that there was some other possibility beside all the heat that had been generated. Now, of course, this is a kind of dramatic example, and some of you might meet me out at the barricade someday, and that's fine. I'll be happy to see you there. But it also happens in the very smallest ways when we're able to be mindful and see the ways that we get entangled in ourselves and with one another. Because our whole neuroscience shows our entire nervous system is a relational one. That is to say, we are tuned to see who's around us, to sense whether their intentions are malevolent or beneficial, or we can be peaceful, how we can collaborate or cooperate. We are, more than anything, we are the human beings that have developed the way we have because we're a collaborative and cooperative species through our language and our imagination and all the things that we share. And our whole being is tuned to relationship. So mindfulness is the invitation to quiet the mind, tend the heart, and then to begin to see the possibility not of the small self that gets reactive and frightened, but to see things in a new and more liberated way. So I got this letter from a middle schooler, full of grammatical errors and misspelling. Seriously, it's spelled C-E-R, like cereal. Dude, it's in a sort of, young, like sixth, seventh grade handwriting, sixth grade. I came to your meditation center with my school. When I went, I didn't take any of your meditating seriously till I started to get in big fights with my parents and myself. I recalled the time we spent meditating and how good it felt because I was alone in my own little world. There's a lot of wisdom in this. So I took the little knowledge I had about meditation one night after a long fight with my mom and went out on the roof and started meditating, tried to do what you told us to do. And when I opened my eyes and went back into my house, I was not as mad. I don't know what it is about meditating helps, but I do know it helps me with my anger and my thoughts. Thank you 1,000 times for the gift you've given us and our school. So it's not all that complicated in a way, but to understand that the point of quieting ourselves is to see with new eyes, to see in a new way, and to step from the reactive, separate sense of self to realize we're all in this together. And then knowing that we're actually interwoven, that we are life connected with itself. Then there comes spontaneously from Buddha nature or whatever language that you want to use, your innate goodness, the ability both to sense that you're connected with all, and then also to tend with care the words and the particular life you've been given. As our friend Ramdas says, to remember your Buddha nature and your social security number somehow, to have kind of, because we're multidimensional beings, like light that's both a wave and a particle, we have a separate sense of self there's a healthy kind of sense of that when it's married to the sense of vastness, that who we are is an evolving energy field, a process of life that's also connected with every breath that we take, which was breathed by the person sitting 2 people away from you just 3 seconds before, that we're in it together. Thich Nhat Hanh says the mind and heart is like a piece of land planted with many different kinds of seeds. Seeds of joy, of peace, of mindfulness, understanding, and love. And seeds of craving, anger, fear, hate, and forgetfulness. These healthy and unhealthy seeds are always there, sleeping in the soil of the heart and mind, in consciousness itself. The quality of your life and the life of those around you depends on the seeds you water. If you water a seed of peace in your heart, peace will grow. When seeds of happiness are watered, you'll become happy. When seeds of anger are watered, you'll become angry. The seeds that are watered frequently are those that will grow strong. So in some way, the teachings offer us the ability, one another, to tend the garden of our own heart and to tend the garden of this earth.
Oh, see why I love him?
Thank you, Jack.
You're welcome, my dear. Is that what you asked for?
Well, he usually likes me to go first because I think it's easier to go second, actually. You can kind of blame whatever happens in your talk on the talk that went before, but in Jack's case, it's always good. So I just have to get comfortable in this chair. Can you hold this for a second?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you want another cushion?
No, I unfolded and I have to fold up again. Okay. Thank you.
Would you like this tea?
Oh, no, thanks. This is better. Thank you. Yeah, so the talk on this teaching of how, as I said, we could understand, this whole teaching of dependent origination is how one thing leads to another, how things happen because of other things. And Jack framing it in a relational understanding is beautiful, because the way that it's taught and the way that we often understand it is more as an internal process that happens within ourselves. And of course, it affects everything else, because how we perceive the world, that affects how we act in the world. Whether I perceive you as a friend or a threat completely affects everything that I think and feel about you and how I act towards you. It's useful. It's a description, and it's useful to recognize. It's a description of how suffering arises in our lives, how we get tangled up in it, and then it also describes how we can untangle. And so the way that happens is, it's really useful to see, because first of all, it helps us understand that this is the way things happen. This is what was discovered, that is the core of what the Buddha saw and taught and felt discouraged about. How would he ever convey it to people? I feel a little daunted by that as well. And I didn't happen upon that understanding as thoroughly as the Buddha. But I think what's helpful in the description is that it just underscores our shared humanity. That this is how we get caught. This is how everybody gets caught. It's not just, how Marion or Erica or Robin or, excuse me, I did it again. I always want to call you Robin. Angela. This doesn't even sound like Robin. Maybe you remind me of my cousin Robin. I don't know. Or Robert. Anyway, the way that we all get caught and struggle. And I think having a description of that can be helpful in helping us untangle from it. And so the principle, the way that it most simply is phrased is, if this is, then this also is. If this is, then this also exists. Through the arising of this, that arises. And the same is true that if this is not here, this isn't either. And that when this stops too. So it's really very simple causality. And we could say that everything, all phenomena are like this and conform to this. So in that sense, it's just like this universal law. But when we apply it to the difficulties that we have in our lives, the suffering that we have in our lives, it gets broken down into 12 very specific links. And they happen kind of automatically, very unconsciously in our experience. And to begin to discern them and see, this is this and this is that, and it takes some practice. But it just describes how, with the arising of our actual just awareness of consciousness itself, how all the experiences that happen with the contact of our senses with our world through our experience of just being alive, how this all leads us through our life. You can look at it in the course of a lifetime, from birth to old age and death, or we can look at it in terms of our momentary experience. And as a description of how suffering comes to be, I'm going to read the links to you. And remember, these are not inevitable. Just because they're automatic when we're not conscious of them doesn't mean that they're inevitable. That just as they lead to how we get tangled up in our suffering, the corollary is also true. We can trace them back to how we can get free. And this is a very bad joke that I heard recently. You might know it. Why doesn't the meditator want to have Novocaine at the dentist? Because they want to transcend dental medication. And this is an appropriate joke for this moment, because the teaching of how you unwind the suffering is called transcendent dependent origination. Transcending the suffering and tangles and difficulties leading to freedom, and that's unfolding in the direction of freedom instead of in the direction of suffering. So what begins, and I realize this is way too big of a topic for one talk, so I'll probably wind up talking about it next week too, but it all begins with what's called ignorance. And in the mindfulness teachings, ignorance doesn't mean not knowing how to work the sound system or ignorance about any specific thing. It refers to this kind of unconsciousness that we have where we just aren't aware, really, of what's happening. And this unawareness that really is the foundation for the things that Jack was talking about, the foundation for hate, for racism, for bias, for discrimination of all kinds. And the specific meaning in this tradition is not knowing about the Eightfold Path that Jack mentioned, not knowing the simple, what we call the Four Noble Truths, that there is an aspect of our life, a dimension that just never is exactly perfect. You know that feeling when you have a moment that feels so perfect, like I felt it in the ocean this morning, just so perfect, and you want it to last forever. But of course it can't, either because you have to go take a shower and get dressed, or because even if I stayed there, it would not stay perfect. I would get cold, or the waves would change and the currents would change. It just doesn't ever stay the same. So because of this shifting, impermanent nature of things, they're always imperfect in some way. And this is the first truth of our life. And then the second one is the way that we actually don't accept that truth, but we want to stay with things. We want to stay with that perfect moment. It's so hard to accept that the next morning we might look at that person and not feel the same way as we did the night before. But that happens sometimes, doesn't it? Or even our most beloved can say or do something that in that moment, something very different from love arises. And we all know those feelings when they happen. So really, ignorance means specifically ignoring the way that we get tangled up in our wanting things to be different, and the way that we forget that just by letting go, we can change our lives and have something new happen than what we're constantly used to. By letting go of that habitual pattern, whatever it may be, we can be free. So the links are, first, our mental formations, and that means everything that, our anger, our joy, our whatever is being formed in our consciousness. Then consciousness, then what we call namarupa, the connection of mind and body. Our senses, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, old age and death, and then the whole thing starts over again, beginning with ignorance, and on and on and on. And the only good news when you look at this, really, is that our suffering or unhappiness can actually lead us to search for a way to do things better in our lives. In 12-step, it's called the gift of desperation. It's, you get so desperate and at the end of your rope that you're willing to finally do something. And that feeling is so unpleasant and so painful. Why would it be called a gift, right? Because it leads us to either a program or teachings or practices that can bring us more happiness and relief. So this whole, what they called this mass of tangle and suffering and looking at how it comes to be over a lifetime. And actually that understanding goes into previous lifetimes too. We can look at how maybe things that happened, I don't have this conscious experience, so I don't teach about it. I don't know what happened to me in previous lives. I don't even know if I had them because I don't remember them. And because my dad was a scientist, and I have been, until this past year, quite skeptical about it. But we can look at that in terms of causes and conditions from a previous lifetime, if that's your understanding, into this lifetime, and what we do in this lifetime, conditioning future lifetimes. But I find it much more workable and practical to just look at moment to moment, how we're clinging to things, and how in these 12 links, the contact with the senses, just happens automatically. The eye sees a form. The eye encounters, makes contact with, let's say, the form of Albert, and then happy to see you again, Albert. And then out of that form comes the seeing Albert. And then, of course, all the associations I have to why I'm happy to see him. But that happens with each of our senses. It's absolutely automatic. But then with that contact of seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, and the mind thinking and feeling is also considered a sense in this tradition. So with that contact, we also always have a feeling, that feeling tone that we've talked about, of things being pleasant and us liking them, or unpleasant and we dislike them, or neutral and we ignore them. And with that feeling, we have a reaction to that feeling, which is, if we like it, we crave it. We want more of it. It's completely natural. And when we want more of it, then it's like, that's like leaning toward it. I mean, the image I always have is chocolate, like leaning toward that next piece of chocolate. I know exactly where it is in the pantry at all times. I'm sure you do too. And the problem is, right, if we hide it, well, we hid it, so we know where it's hidden too. But along with that leaning toward it, the craving part, like, oh, yum, yum, that would be good right now. There's the next step, which is, I'm going to make it happen. The clinging enough to the craving to walk into the pantry to find it and open it. Sometimes I would hesitate if it hasn't been opened yet, but I'm sure you know that too. Like, because you know if you open it, right, then there's a whole bar of it. Anyway, so there's that clinging, and then there's becoming. And then I identify, like Jack was talking about with identification. I now have opened the chocolate, I am taking it, and now I'm beginning to become the person who is eating the chocolate. And that identity of the one who eats the chocolate, that will bring further feelings, maybe feelings of joy or feelings of exasperation and self-hatred. I mean, and everything in between, right? Depending on when you last opened a bar of chocolate. Because if it was 5 minutes before, the feeling is likely to be shame. If it wasn't, if it was yesterday, then it's joyful. This is just, of course, in general, and an example that tries to make practical actually something that's a little complex to describe. And so when we establish this new identity, we take birth as that person who is either riddled with shame or feeling quite pleasantly good. And then we're ready to begin the whole cycle again with the next experience. And I really could go on and on about these steps, but when we have taken birth with that new identity, which we're doing, moment to moment, whatever we're doing, when we take birth into that new identity, it can feel good, of course. It's not a bad thing, but it does create and heighten the sense of self that separates us from others. And that brings the comparing mind. And I can compare myself to either Jack, who has transcended carbs for the moment and isn't eating chocolate at all. And then I can just feel like this mass of, greed and sensuous longing and things like that. Or I could compare myself to, I don't know who is completely, let's just choose a fictional person who's completely out of control around chocolate, could never eat just 2 squares or 3. And then I can feel like a good girl compared to them. And we do this all the time. And then if we're not wanting or craving anything, I love this example that Joseph uses. We might open a catalog and leaf through the catalog and see if we can find something to want. Because, we're supposed to be wanting. That will make us happy. And now I actually was planning to go back through the chain that leads to freedom. But given the time, I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to leave us in this tangle of how suffering and identity get created because, right, the gift of desperation, out of being caught in the tangle, we search for a way out. This way you will be sure to come back next week and hear the way out of our craving and clinging and identities that are constantly being born along with these experiences that we have emerging from into the present moment, from the endless stream of possibilities and events that we could choose to be involved with, engaged in, and identify with. Things that are bearing down on us from the past. I'm hungry, or it's pretty fascinating, and the fact of the impermanence of all of it just allows it to become the condition for the arising of the whole new cycle again, the cycle of the origin and entanglement with that which causes suffering, or the cycle of transcending. What are we transcending? We're transcending being habitually, constantly caught in the same old pattern of craving, clinging, identity, craving, clinging, becoming, and birth. And how do we get unborn? Tune in next week. Tune in next week, and we will discuss the how we transcend dental medication. More than proactive, just respond to requests. But when this room, for example, and I mention this often because when I look around this room, I see the consequences of deliberate practices that were done to segregate us from each other. Why are we mostly white people in this room? Not all, of course, but it's so different from our other center in East Hollywood. And the answer is because of practices like redlining that made sure that, people of color didn't move into white neighborhoods. And, we just are living with a legacy of these kinds of things. And so they require action to change them. Otherwise, we just perpetuates itself, like the cycle of dependent origination. The suffering will just perpetuate itself in a kind of automatic way. So I don't have a clear answer except to try to take a deep breath and imagine myself in the shoes of whoever it is I'm totally disapproving of in that moment, and what would help, if anything would help. I think of it particularly with the child abuse example because I remember many times during years when I was a single mom feeling like, wow, the only thing that separates me from somebody who actually abuses their child is mindfulness and awareness and the presence of mind to know that even though I feel like putting them out for the trash collectors, I won't actually do it. And that is an accident of privilege, of finding this practice that helped me control myself. Or do you know what I mean? Like, that's a long answer and not very clear, but thank you for the question, Ali.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I had a question from Jack, but I did want to share something because I really liked your question. And what's your name? Lisa. So I've had that experience. Everybody does. So I was just thinking we need a much bigger mind, like Suzuki Roshi used to say. We have to give our cows a big pasture, in terms of we're not trying to control our thoughts so much. And anyone that's meditated will know, in a sense, there's something magical about sitting. And on another level, we can find a lot of scientific evidence of why sitting works. But my point is I think we're going to get in trouble if we value the Buddhist teaching as a social action tool, but it's really more a practice. And so to connect with what I was saying about Big Mind, I was thinking we have to be realistic. And from what I've got from the Buddhist teaching, there is karmic results, but usually they happen not in this life, but in if we do a lot of good on one level or another, we'll be reborn in a situation that's utopian, possibly. So anyway, I'm not saying I really love like Judaism, and you might be able to help me. Tiktaalen, what's it called? To fix a broken world or make the world better?
Tikkun olam. Tikkun olam.
Tikkun Olam. Yeah. So,
Olam.
Olam. So I love that idea, and it's inspiring. Uh, but I think as a Buddhist, we have to realize there's a much bigger letting go in the beginning, uh, to let go, and in a sense, non-judgmental. So in a sense, it's exciting because we might come up with something fresh. But anyway, I just wanted to share that, my 2 cents. But I think it's a good idea. It's not like we're trying to avoid the goal, but it's much more personal. Like if I don't flip somebody off, and when I'm driving, that does something mean driving to me, that's a good sign for me.
That's a good sign. Thank you.
Yeah, and that leads to relaxation. But my question was with Jack, when you were saying mindfulness, you were saying sampajana.
Yes.
So this is the first time I heard this, which is exciting. I've thought of it before. Alan Wallace wrote a really good article about mindfulness and as Western Buddhist teachers, and he pointed out a lot of stuff, and I like that article. So with that, I personally think that's probably truer what you're saying. But then, how do we put it into perspective in the English words if we're thinking mindfulness is closer to sampajana? What's sati?
So I think just mindfulness has two parts: mindful presence, sati, and mindful response. And if you see it in that way, then and also there's a really lovely book, for those who are interested in further study, by Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's one of the most celebrated translators in the world, called The Buddha's Teachings on Social Justice and Social Harmony, that's full of teachings about how to apply the kind of question that Ali was asking as well, how to apply not just mindful presence, but then wise society or wise response, and they can go together, basically. That's so. Thank you for
Yeah, but my question was about the if sampajana is more akin to the American term mindfulness, what's sati?
I think no. I would say sati means mindful presence, and
Oh.
sampajanya
Oh.
means mindful response.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay,
it's
think of it
presence and response.
that way. Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
Hi.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, good, good. So anyway, by no means can I do this all the time, but when there is someone who is extremely irritable or irritates me, I say to myself, here comes my teacher. And to look at it as the challenge is on. And inside of me, how am I going to maneuver? And it includes everything that has been said already from everyone in terms of how to be proactive. And all these are learnings of how to be assertive and how to figure out a way that works for everyone. Now, of course, there's people that are over the top. And in that case, one has to say to themselves, so I am going to be kind of compromised in terms of my view. And if I have to move, that's going to also be part of my teaching. And it's going to be that I am going to maneuver in a way that was kind of meant to be for me to see it from a different angle and a different perspective, after asking in a very assertive way, can we do this together, kind of thing. So looking at, I'm not professing that can do it as all the time, but if I can get geared up and kind of say that all human beings are imperfect and the imperfection can be extreme, and to look at it as this is my teacher. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if my watch is right. I want to see. Oh, okay. Okay. So I think that's all the questions we can have right this morning. But we do have next week together. And I love, Jack, that you said this was your favorite part, because I love this part too. And it's because I get to hear from you instead of just me, which I already know what I'm going to say, more or less. But it's really great to hear from all of you. So thank you for your participation in that way. And I also want to be sure, before we do our dedication of merit, that is our formal closing of our time together, I want to be sure to talk about dana, giving, gift. It's hard to talk about because we have to do it over and over again. But it's also hard to talk about because we have, I have ideas that it's really not okay to ask for help or support. It's not the best thing. The best thing is to be self-reliant and independent, and right, that's sort of what our culture teaches. We do need your help and support at InsightLA. And yesterday I was teaching a workshop for women with Maria Egan, and we were teaching at the Canyon, at Benedict Canyon property that we acquired. And Maria said, tell how you got this property, because it looks like we're sitting on millions of dollars having this property. And so I explained that it was a distressed nonprofit who needed to give it to another nonprofit, and that the land is being held in perpetuity as conservation land, as for nature. We can't ever sell it or make money on it. It can't ever be sold, which is a beautiful thing. And I just say that to you because it can look like you look on the website, and we're going to have a new website, hopefully by the end of this next week, hopefully. And if any of you have ever tried to find anything on our current website, you will be clapping also that we're getting, the new one's been in the works for 10 months. So I grew up in a Catholic neighborhood, so may it be all that we hope and need it to be. But if you look at the website, it just looks like, oh my God, there's a million things happening. And oh, they've got 3 centers now. And whoa, business must be booming. And well, it is and it isn't. It's wonderful that we have all this happening and so many things. It's also true that there's so many like drop-in centers now that are just providing that, and you can take a sound bath, or you can, I don't know, I want to go to get a mani-pedi there. I want the meditation center where you can have that done while you meditate, because I don't know how anybody has time for that. And here in LA, it's like part of good grooming, right? If you don't, it's like your toenails are ragged. It's like you didn't brush your teeth or something. Anyway, if somebody would like to start that center, I will be your first customer. But there's just a lot that happens that is invisible. Like we come and sit in this room. What's the big deal? Come and sit here and do nothing, really, for a couple hours. But the rent for it, oh my God. Or do you know, there's just so much that happens behind everything else. And it's sort of like the chain of causality, and everything affects everything else. So we need and appreciate your support. I just want to say that the best way I have heard from those who know better than I do to support InsightLA is to become a monthly donor. The other way would be to every Sunday, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here, you're the ones who stayed, every Sunday to give what you would give if you went to a movie or a yoga class. You know, if everybody in this room gave $15, we would really be helped by that. But it averages out to about $3 or $4 per person, which isn't so helpful in the long run for us. So this is a plea for any live stream friends to press the donate button, and for all of us to just remember how it's the work of so many hands and the offering of so many hours of people's lives that deserve to be compensated. We don't operate on an all donation volunteer basis, even though that is ideally such a beautiful way to operate. I did try it when we first moved here, but it was just frankly too hard and we couldn't make it. So we're partly operating with charging program fees and speaker series and benefits and things like that that provide revenue, and we're partly operating about 25% due to your philanthropy, because that's what it is. When you put some money in the bowl, it's your philanthropy and your generosity, for which we are deeply grateful. So that said, I'd like us to just sit for a moment together. And whenever we come to the end of a period of study and practice together, listening to teachings and putting them into practice and being in community, because this is really what sustains our practice, is having a community, having the presence of each other where we can touch base and refuel for the coming week. That our appreciation and gratitude for anything we've learned, anything that's been beneficial or good for us in doing this, we offer freely from our hearts to all beings everywhere without exception. We offer the goodness of our practice so that we and all beings can continue to grow in love and understanding. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.